Preparing to live stream, setting up your meeting for YouTube Live. And then it'll send us the link, and then we'll be good to go. Oh, okay. And here we are. All right, I'm going to send out the tweets and stuff, and then we will get going. All right. Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to the Craft Podcast, where we interview experts of various fields to learn about their disciplines and how they strive towards mastery. I'm Dan Tedesco with my co-host, Michael Du, and we are really passionate about talking to people who have also been passionate enough to master something. And we're excited to share the interviews we do with all of you today. So I really encourage you to subscribe right now. It's if you subscribe, you get a totally free lifetime subscription to our interviews, and you may or may not win $1 billion. No promises, but it could happen. So let's get right into it. Michael, who is with us today?
Today, we're joined by Leonie Valentine. Leonie is a seasoned executive with over 30 years of experience in navigating complex business environments. And she has held C-level positions in startups and major corporations across the Asia-Pacific region. And Leonie is a transformational leader who uses a pragmatic approach to deliver long-lasting and sustainable change. In her role as the managing director of Google Hong Kong, she designed a thought leadership program that continues to shape the city's digital landscape today. And Leonie is a lifelong learner and is passionate about understanding the latest in digital and data technologies. We're honored to have Leonie Valentine on the show, and we look forward to discussing her insights and experiences in customer services, experiences and sales, and also technology and government. Leonie, welcome to the Craft Podcast.
Thank you very much, Michael. Nice to see you, and nice to see you as well, Dan.
Great. So Leonie, to kick it off, we like to start with people's kind of superhero origin stories.
Right.
What drew you to customer service and BD early on? Were there signs from little Leonie back in the day that would be a path you would take?
Possibly not. It's quite funny that you mentioned superhero, because I was joking with somebody recently. In the Deadpool movies, there's a superhero and her name is Lucky. And Deadpool actually says to her, luck is not a superpower. And she says, it is, right? And I always feel like if I was going to have a superpower, my superpower is kind of luck. And it's a really interesting one. So I think a lot of the luck that I had early on was that I had terrifically good parents and a great family. So my father was a local doctor in country Victoria in Australia. And my mother originally worked for the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank in Hong Kong, started out as a secretary, ended up as one of their first computer operators in the days of mainframes and punch cards.
Wow.
But when she married my dad and moved to Australia, she could no longer work because, back in the 60s and 70s, doctors' wives did not work. So she threw herself into community service. So mum was never home. I mean, she didn't have a job, but she was always with the Red Cross or the Country Women's Association or hanging out at her church. And she was always baking and doing things, golf club. And my father was always working in the community. People would turn up to the house, when they'd accidentally chopped their toe off with an axe, or
Oh,
something
man.
like that, because we did live in the country, right? And so
Wow.
from a very early age, I think my parents instilled this idea of serving others, serving the community, and actually serving your own family. So that was great. I think also because they were both from overseas, my dad was from England, my mother was born in Shanghai, raised in Hong Kong. We also had lots of connections around the globe because our family was spread, across Italy, England, the US, Hong Kong, and Australia. So I think one of the other things that gave me was this ability to be a natural connector and networker, because our families were from different places. Some of my family members, their first language is not English, it's Chinese. Some of my family members, actually, their first language is Spanish in the US, and by marriage, some of my cousins-in-law, etc. So that also, I think, gives you a natural curiosity in terms of understanding other people, other cultures, and really making an effort to connect and find something interesting to talk about. And so those early lessons were really great in terms of serving me well for a future in service and business development, because I'm genuinely interested in other people and they find me genuinely interesting to talk to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a two-way street, right?
It is. That's
Yeah.
pretty
And
cool.
when you were speaking about luck too, it made me think of this Thomas Jefferson quote. He wrote once, "I'm a firm believer in luck. I find the harder I work, the more I have of it."
That's exactly right.
Just the idea.
You go.
Right. The idea that it's not that you can generate luck to some extent based on the actions that you take and the perspective that you have.
Absolutely. So I always think about it, it's not blind luck. It's actually being in the right place at the right time, sure, but with the right skills, experience, and attitude. And if you have all of those things in combination, then the universe kind of, I think, organizes for you to have great opportunities. So a lot of it's about, I think, also the openness and having that right attitude. But yeah, working very hard to create your own luck is very true, I think.
Yeah. So then going forward a bit, I'm curious, how did kind of education and early jobs kind of, because for a lot of people in life that there's a bit of path dependency based on, choices that you make or things that happen at that time. So education, early career, how did that kind of, continue this, the serving and the natural connector parts of you?
So, I started working part-time when I was 15 in Australia. I got a job in a local service station. So, you'd pump petrol and then go and slice ham. Obviously, you want to wash your hands in between those two things, between the deli and the petrol pumping. So that was one of my earliest experiences whilst I was also studying. I wasn't a particularly good sports person, so that was probably quite lucky in some respects. So I spent my time either studying, hanging out with friends, or working part-time. And I think that really developed more of my social game. For a lot of, I think, young people, actually having sport is great for their social game. But for me, because I naturally wasn't that great at a lot of sports when I was younger, I didn't gravitate towards that. I actually found it quite difficult, and I didn't really like the competition. I like to be self-competitive, if that makes sense. So it's why I liked in studies, the only person I was trying to better was myself. Right? Yeah. I looked at my score and I thought, well, that maybe not good enough. I could do better next time by doing X, Y, and Z. So I liked that sort of stuff. And then because again, I mentioned about my family, I just genuinely liked hanging out with people and talking about things. And I learn by osmosis. I learn by sponge-like learning, talking to people, understanding where they've been. And I just love having conversations. So I think that sort of early education was very much partly book-based, but very much about my social game. Mm-hmm. And then, my parents really reinforced in me the I think the opportunities that would come from actually going to university, doing well and going to university. I didn't do as well as I hoped I would. You know, unfortunately, during my final year of high school, I got a boyfriend who was a little bit older, and that kind of blew my final year scores. But I ended up going to, social game was a bit too good at that point. But I did end up going to Melbourne University and starting my degree. But unfortunately, at the same time, my dad ended up losing his position at a local hospital. At 55, he ended up being unemployed, and I ended up having to drop out of second year university. Now, it was actually a great life lesson because I could fall back on my part-time work. I went and did bar work for half a year while I worked out what I was going to do. I tried to get a full-time job, with a year and a half of university under my belt. And it was the height of a recession in the late 80s in Australia. And I just couldn't get a full-time job outside of hospitality. So that service mindset really served me well at that point in time. And I realized the value of actually having a degree behind me. I needed to go and finish what I had started and complete my science degree and see what happened after that. So, I still continued to do both, worked my way through my university, my first university degree. And then again, as luck would have it, I ended up sitting in the common room at Melbourne University's geology department. And I looked at this piece of paper and it said, "We'll pay you $40 to be interviewed." And I thought, how does that work? So I rang this number. It was BP Australia. I spoke to the woman and she said, yep, we're training our managers on a new interview technique. It's actually very like Google's interview technique, targeted selection. And if you come in for just 2 or 3 hours, we'll pay you $40. And this is 1989, I think it was. So for me, that was quite a lot of money, right? 89 or 90. And so I got into that program. And what I realized later is that the graduate coordinator was actually one of my teachers from high school, a lady by the name of Jacinta. So at the end of all of those interviews, I spoke to a couple of the managers and said, "This program, your graduate program, sounds really interesting. What sort of people are you looking for?" And this guy, Arthur, said to me, "People just like you, Leonie, why don't you apply?" And again, in terms of how luck works, as luck would have it, when I applied the following year, this fellow Arthur actually sponsored me into the near final interviews. I made it through 2,000 applicants, through 30 people that had the face-to-face interviews over a 2-day interview process. And I was one of 8 people selected for that graduate program that year.
Wow.
Yeah, which was pretty cool. Amazing opportunity. And at BP, the graduate program, just back in 1991, 92, was unbelievable in terms of the exposure to the business, the exposure to senior leaders, and then also a catalogue, which was an old school binder of all of the different courses that you could take to better yourself, financial management, negotiation skills, influencing skills, whatever you liked. And what I didn't appreciate at that time in the early 90s is that was actually quite groundbreaking for a large traditional organisation. And again, lucky for me, it really set me on a fantastic path in terms of my career, just thinking that was kind of normal, right? Dealing with senior leaders, talking to the chief executive or the head of retail, working directly with the CMO, all of that's perfectly normal. And being able to have an organisation that sponsors your learning as well, totally normal.
Right. Wow. Yeah. And what a great story of perseverance that, you kind of kept searching for and exploring, like even how did you even think of, you did this thing they were paying you $40 to test out interview questions on you, and then you turn that into a job.
Yeah, as I said, I'm not a bad networker communicator.
Yeah.
And also, I think one of the things, Dan, as you know, I think likability goes a long way. I genuinely try to be a good person. I genuinely have other people's interests at heart. And I think that authenticity actually has always shone through. That, initially, I think because I'm quite a big extrovert. So sometimes people who don't know me well get that wrong. They think, oh, wow, LV is all about herself. And it's actually not the case. It's quite the opposite. I'm very much about what can I do for others? How can I help others? And I think that genuine wanting to have a connection and really wanting to understand people on a relatively deep level, relatively quickly, has served me very well. And it's surprising, I think, Dan and Michael, one of the things that I find, and particularly when I was dealing with clients in places like Hong Kong even, where, I got warned that the clients are very traditional and you should be careful not to overshare. And sure, some of them were like that, but some of my best friends in Hong Kong now were clients of mine when I was there. And very quickly we formed quite deep friendships because of this openness, I think, and because I genuinely wanted to understand their life, their aspirations, what they did for fun outside of work, and not in an overly intrusive way, in a way that was patient and calm, and I think listened quite a lot and really understood what a lot of those signals, when it was a bit too much and they didn't want to share, or when it was just enough and they felt very comfortable, because as you would know, you have to sort of establish that trusted relationship before people really want to open up. I'm just quite lucky, I think, that as somebody that comes across as being sort of open and genuine, I do tend to form trusted relationships quite quickly, which is great, and I love that.
Yeah, and I guess going more into that. So fast forward, some years, and you've had multiple experiences where you've been leading large teams in large organizations, and kind of it's there are a lot of reasons where it's hard to be like open and empathetic in that type of situation, because the pressure is on someone in a role like that. And I remember when you and I first met, you were leading this large team at Google Hong Kong, and you made this point to emphasize how you would take a lot of time to meet customers, I think on a weekly basis. And, that struck me as a healthy thing to do, but also in very large organizations, what tends to get people ahead is, or sometimes is kind of the internal promotion and networking. And, how do you think about that balance, and how have you navigated it over your career?
Yep. So, I mean, for me, customers and customer experience is kind of the number one thing, right? I haven't worked in government or community organisations, so I can only talk about commercial experience and working for companies. Customers are the lifeblood of a company. If you don't have customers, you don't have anything. I remember years ago, I was working with a group of software developers, and one of the developers said to me, "Check it out, LV, I've built this new thing." And I said, "That's great, but nothing really exists until it gets sold." And they couldn't understand what I was saying to them, but I'm like, we need to have a customer that wants to buy that thing, right? There's no point us investing. This is the time we were doing custom application development for and on behalf of customers. We weren't a product company, we were a services company. So if you were spending effort on building a service that nobody had yet bought, then possibly wasn't the best use of your time. If you wanted to be inventing and building those products, you probably should be in a product company. Right. So I always make the point that the customers were basically our greatest source of learning. They can also be, I think, sometimes both happy and unhappy. And one of the other things that I loved to do with customers, and even in Hong Kong as well, was go and have conversations, very open ones, with our unhappy customers. Find out what was actually making them unhappy, what were their ideas and how we could fix it, and then be very pragmatic and practical about what I could actually do to make it better. Because sometimes, depending on the situation, some of the demands from a customer might appear to be unreasonable. When you actually unpack that and ask, why are they asking for this particular thing? Why do they think it works that way? What difference would it make if it was, to be different? you can then start to get under the cover and say, okay, well, I can't exactly do that thing that you want, but what if we do this? What if we just change this? And I think 9 times out of 10, you get to a compromise situation where both parties can actually be happy, but you can't do that unless you're prepared to step in to uncomfortable conversations, unhappy customers, and have really good, I think, open, not quite debate, but a little bit challenging about what could be better. And you have to be open to that. I think too many organizations, too many large organizations now almost have a bloody mindedness that it's us against them, or I'm right and you're wrong, rather than entertaining the possibilities of what happens if we step into that grey. What happens if we step into a place where we're both uncomfortable, and how do we think about making things better? The other thing I love about talking to customers is customers, and this was true also in Google. I mean, Google very much is a product company where you're pushing products out. But the other part in terms of the usage of those products and novel uses of those products, a lot of that comes from customers. So I'm a huge fan of customer-driven innovation, actually thinking about how you collaborate with customers to find other ways to use products to get some of their ideas on what actually makes sense for them, or even tying a series of those products together so that they can do something really interesting for their own business. You know, and today that could be AI-enabled chatbots or whatever. So, you know, my recent experience, we used a Google platform and a third-party company. We'd originally had their chatbot just in the contact center, but then realized pretty quickly as a customer that the same technology should actually apply to the website in terms of having the same information base and then surfacing it out somewhere else. So we ended up doing that. And that wasn't naturally a place for that organization to play. The third-party company had always done their work with the contact center, not with the digital and web development teams. But the way that I looked at it in terms of how I was going to serve customers, they actually wanted the same digital experience, whether they were calling the contact center or whether they were putting it through the website, you know, in a chatbot. So then why wouldn't we have the same underlying technology and the same ability for that machine learning to learn from the same database? It makes sense. And that's a good example, I think, of customer-driven innovation. When you have those conversations, I think with customers, between customers, partners, and other third parties, you can really find some great ways to innovate for and on behalf of your own customers as well. Does that make sense, Dan?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I can't help but go on a little tangent. Was this chatbot, you know, pre or post ChatGPT?
It is pre-ChatGPT.
Okay.
Yeah. But remembering as well, I mean, ChatGPT is interesting if you're actually scraping all of the information on the internet. When you're actually dealing with an internal organization and the particular practices within an organization, it has to be able to learn from the information within that organization, within, you know, a secured, these are my customers, this is how we interact with them, this is how we solve their problems. That information is not freely available. So, I mean, I have spoken to organizations here in Australia where they have been some of the early pilot organizations for ChatGPT because they've allowed that technology on the inside of their organization to make what they deliver better. And that's cool. I mean, Bard, similarly from Google, been dealing with that technology set for quite a long time because it is the underpinning of a lot of Google products as well. But I think one of the things about thinking about generative AI, it's great to be able to answer these questions and to produce content, and that's a really good thing. I think what should be next is actually thinking about how that enables either more efficient workflows or more efficient customer service. And then what does that actually mean in terms of being a true partner to an individual within an organization? So, you know, there's some stuff that I'm actually thinking about doing next, which is talking to, you know, a couple of friends perhaps about building something in that space. Yeah, I love, yeah, as you know, Dan, I love that sort of technology, AI, ML. It's really interesting, and the possibilities are endless.
Yeah, well, that's great. I mean, we're obsessed with it. You know, half of our past interviews have been about generative AI, and Michael and I sometimes live stream us just coding silly little things with ChatGPT. So yeah, it's we're excited about it, and it's cool to hear that you're thinking about these technologies too. And I think it's actually a great example of there's a lot of opportunity with what you were describing before about customer-driven innovation.
Absolutely.
Because tools like what OpenAI is building, Bard and the other things Google are building, they're great platforms, but how to actually integrate them into a specific vertical is not a natural or easy thing. And that's probably where the biggest opportunities for people who are not advanced machine learning researchers to kind of build like commercial organizations around.
Yeah. I mean, and the thing is, again, when you're training machine learning models, as we know, you actually need a lot of data and a lot of data sets to be able to train it the right way. I think one of the things when we talk about AI and ML, we also need to have a parallel conversation about regulation and about the government, and making sure that it's done always in a very responsible way, right? Because I think you can actually get off the path where these things are for benefit, because obviously in anything to do with technology, there are loads and loads of people who really want to build technology for good, but equally there are quite a few bad actors out there on the internet, and they're looking to find ways to counterfeit, they're looking for ways to infiltrate, they're looking for ways to actually have cyber attacks and ransom demands and all kinds of things. So, some of the generative AI technologies, it's fantastic, and it's a really great development, I think, for humankind. But I remember seeing a YouTube video many years ago, I've tried to find it again, of President Obama actually talking about cyber and cyber warfare. And what he said was, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said, we actually need more good guys to be working on this stuff than the bad actors. That's how we'll win. So it's very interesting to me. Even, I was looking at LinkedIn today and this debate about should we actually stop, and 1,000 business leaders saying we should just stop at this point in time until things like regulation or the rules catch up. I don't think you can actually stop once you've unbottled the genie. But what you can do is you can work very quickly to make sure that you have the right frameworks, right? That you're building these things responsibly, and then that you're also collaborating, I think, with government and with legislators to make sure that it is actually governed in the right way. Right? Fascinating, but it's a huge area of interest, and I'm only scratching the surface on what I know in that space, and I just find the whole thing fascinating. It's going to keep me busy for decades. And Michael, I'll still be talking to you about this in at least a decade or two.
All right, yeah. Well, we'll have to have round two that's kind of just AI focused. Maybe we won't even have to be here. It'll just be our AI avatars talking to each other.
It's exactly right. Exactly right. Although, hey, it's quite funny. I think the whole metaverse is a little bit overblown. I'm still a huge fan, I think, of not virtual reality, but augmenting our own reality and augmenting ourselves with technology. I don't ever want to be replaced. And I think that, in a lot of respects, I am irreplaceable. And I want to hold on to that. I think that's what really makes us human. But I do think that there's so many applications for technology where we could think about actually owning our own virtual assistant and training it in a very secure way, using Web3 type technologies. And then that becomes basically your assistant. You take it with you from job to job, and it helps you do your work. That's where it's all heading.
Yeah. It's a great point. Yeah.
All right. That's what I hope I can build at some point. But anyway.
For round two, it's coming, and probably faster than any of us think, because the technology is ready. It's just how do you put it together into a product that people want to buy and is a safe and responsible use of this stuff. The pieces are all they're out in the open right now. So it's really exciting.
Yeah, but it's like, who was it that said there's nothing to fear but fear itself? So, I'm not fearful. I'm actually really hopeful, and I've always been very hopeful about the benefits of technology, because the benefits really do outweigh the risks. So we just have to make sure, again, that, you know, as we're bringing people into technology and we're building these new products, that we're building them with the right mindset and the right frameworks, and, you know, as to your point, and being really responsible about that. There you go.
Yeah. And in the meantime, you know, we still are working with teams of people. Maybe it'll be teams of people and AI in the near future. But we also want to ask you about some experiences with teams.
Yep.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So like, so maybe like we start with leadership. So have you gotten better as a leader of your career, or like how do you find out? Right. So so
Good question, Mike.
How do you even know?
I don't know. I mean, you know, gosh, you always hope that you get better at things over time, right? Heaven forbid that you're set in stone at the beginning of your career and you end your career basically with the same skills, attributes, and you haven't actually progressed. That's terrible. I never wanted to be one of those people. So from a very early age, again, and I spoke about that, you know, experience of BP being exposed to very senior people, including the CEO. I would observe all of those senior leaders. I would look at the way that they interacted with people. I remember one guy at BP, he was super charismatic, a general manager of retail. So that's a direct report to the CEO back in the day, Bob Constantine. And Bob was really affable, naturally a connector. He could stand on stage in front of 1,200 people and point to somebody and say, Dan, you know what I'm talking about. And everyone in the audience just leaned in. They really felt like he knew them. And he would. And he had all these great techniques. And I was lucky enough that I would go to events with this guy and see him in action. So I learned from that. I observed, I learned. And then as I got the opportunity, you know, as I was starting to lead teams and, you know, leading projects, I would try out some of those techniques. And I just try and work out what fit for me, you know, then reflect on how it was working. I think one of the things I worked out very early in my career is that I'm a very poor impersonation of somebody else, right? And I think in my 20s, what I tried to do was I tried to wear the three-piece suits with the big shoulder pads, you know, back in the 90s, lots of gold buttons.
Oh.
I tried to behave more like some of the role models that I'd seen some of those leaders and do that, but it wasn't authentically me. So I had to reflect and think about, how do I adjust that? Look at some of those really good practices of what I think is awesome in a leader and incorporate that into my own style. So that's the thing I did, was observe, learn, reflect, and then just keep repeating until I got better at it. So, you know, no one, I think I would never say that I'm perfect, and I've never met a perfect leader. And I think the pursuit of perfection is actually a pointless exercise. This is why I love this concept of just lifelong and constant learning. We all have bad days. We all trip ourselves up. And even some of the greatest leaders that I've worked with have had bad days. And I think one of the things that I've been lucky enough to do and to see and to witness is both the good and the bad of some of these leaders, and then how they've recovered from those not so good days. What did they do next? And so I've always endeavored to do kind of the same thing. If I'm not having a great day or a great week, you know, I'll reach out, I'll try and get advice from other people, or I'll just pause, slow it all down for a little while, reflect again, and then try and re-engage. So it's that thing, I think, you never want to leave some things unsaid, right? You know, particularly when we're talking as a leader, you sometimes step into quite emotional and quite difficult conversations. And I think part of being a leader is actually being open to those, to not have judgments, to be prepared to listen, and moreover, be prepared to actually have your mind changed. That's what you've got to do if you really want to be a great leader. Don't be set in stone. As I said, don't start in stone at the beginning of your career and end up the same way. the whole thing, I've always described it, and I think, Dan, you've heard me describe this before. You can take different paths up the same mountain, right? Some people will decide to take the path, which is a straight line path. I want to get promoted and promoted and promoted, and I'm going to get to the top as quickly as possible. I didn't choose that path. I've always chosen the path most interesting. So as I'm climbing the mountain, I kind of stop for a while and think, hey, it's pretty nice here. Maybe I'll do this gig for a while. And then after that, you know, I'll think about which is the path. Am I going to go left or right? Which one of these things is more interesting to me? Because the journey for me is as important as the destination. And I get exposed to so many people and so many opportunities and so many new things like technology and products and services that it's just fascinating and engaging and interesting as you travel that kind of windy path. I just love it. So that's kind of how I've navigated, Michael, the whole leadership journey, right? Take path most interesting, observe where you think people are doing leadership, I think, really well, and then try and incorporate what just feels right for you.
Great. That's a really good license. Yeah, and also I can imagine that, you know, during the journey of your career, there might be some challenges, key challenges, or, you know, that make you learn a lot.
Yep.
And also maybe like feel pretty you know, it's kind of like a reset, right? And then, like, do you have any experiences or stories that you might share on that, and how do you overcome those challenges during your career? Yeah.
Look, lots of different ones. I mean, and some are quite small, and then some are quite, I think, game-changing. So if I think about a small experience in terms of not necessarily being the most senior person in the room, but actually having the ability to do situational leadership. So I remember many years ago, I was at Telstra and we were running an event, and it was game-changing because we'd actually rolled out an IP network to this hotel. We had the Cisco telepresence units on stage, which was a pretty big deal. Very difficult to run that kind of technology outside of an office because we wanted to demonstrate it. So there was a hold up. The event wasn't starting, and I went backstage to find out why, and they couldn't get the machines working. So the connection had failed, right? What they were going to have was two screens on stage and have a facilitated conversation. So, you know, one screen would turn up one leader, the second one would turn up. They'd tried everything. They'd unplugged all the boards. Everybody was running around. There was, you know, directors and all kinds of senior people. And I had a very senior, actually, the director of the state, saying, we just have to start, Leonie. He was demanding that we start because we were holding the customers up. And I said very politely and very calmly, just give me a second, right? So I went and had a chat to everybody. I listened to what they'd already tried. And I paused for a second and I said, what happens if we just use one of these machines? And I said, what do you mean? I said, what happens if we don't have both people on stage at the same time, but we just use one and you can bring those people up individually? And they said, oh, actually, we can do that. All right. So that's what we did. Now, was it exactly the experience that we had designed for this particular event to prove to our customers that that technology was going to work for them? No. But did they know any different? Because it was the only time that they were seeing that event. They didn't. So we still got fantastic scores from the event. The technology was able to be demonstrated, and nobody really realized that the second screen was supposed to have something on it. So I think it's one of those things in terms of, even if you don't have the authority and the title that says you're a leader, I think in these very challenging, very emotionally charged situations, you can show up as a leader in those situations by keeping calm, again, listening, understanding what everything else has been done, and then just pausing for a second to see if there's another opportunity. So that's what I did. I think the second example I give is, you know, when we had quite a lot of interesting challenges, I think, in the Hong Kong market. We first had the protest movement, and then we had pandemic start quite early after it started in China. So one of the things we had to do was actually think about how do we first and foremost protect our team, right? The number one thing as a leader, and I think your responsibility, Yes, we have a responsibility to our customers. The customers always come first. But the next thing is always this responsibility and in equal measures to your team. So understanding the safety and security of the team was really important. And then setting up practices around incident response, crisis management, just making sure that everybody really kept calm and got through those situations was really important. And then one of the things, I mean, I won't go into a lot of detail because it was a very long story, but I think you also have to keep a sense of humor, because these situations, and, you know, we've just all lived through 3 years of COVID, can be quite draining. And I'm somebody, whilst I don't take myself particularly seriously, I take what I do very seriously. And so injecting a little bit of humor and a little bit of humanity into these situations that can seem quite dark is really important. So we had T-shirts printed in different Google colors when I was the managing director of Google Hong Kong. And they just said, keep calm and eat gale udon, which is curried fish balls, right? And it's a local Hong Kong delicacy that I love. And, you know, a lot of my team members thought that was quite funny. But it was just a nice little reminder to us that, like all of these things, no matter how long it took to get out of this situation, which at the time was COVID-19, the pandemic, we just had to be calm about it, because a lot of these situations you can only worry about what you can control. And when you think about what you can control, a lot of it just comes back to you as an individual, right?
Right.
I can work hard on controlling my health, what I eat, how I exercise, right? I can't always control my reactions, but I can control what I do next. So really thinking about that patience and that calm and trying to be quite zen was super important. So I think those are probably the two examples that I'd use, Mike. You know, one pretty simple in terms of an event, what you actually do in that situation, and the other one at a market level and a country level, quite complicated in terms of what it was actually going on in the globe. And then how do you actually think about being a little bit selfless and focusing very much on the health and well-being of your team. Yeah.
Right. Thank you for sharing that. And also, like, maybe we can start talk about technology and also government. And since you have like extensive experience in, and the first question is that what were some of your best and toughest experiences, like bringing technology and government together?
Yep.
So yeah.
So I think again, like all partners for businesses, the government should be viewed basically as a partner to business. I think a lot of government agencies and you know, politicians, regulators, bureaucrats, they do actually want to lean in and learn from tech companies. They're curious about the technologies. Sure, they have concerns, and it's justifiably so on behalf of their citizens, because that's their job, right? Their job is basically to look after the citizens and provide for them. So I think when you're working with government, it's always been a tricky one. I think in my early days of selling, I actually ended up selling more to corporates because I didn't really understand how I would deal with government. Like, you know, I spoke to some of, back 20 years ago, I spoke to some of the salespeople that dealt with government, and they couldn't even buy them a cup of coffee because it would be looked upon as, you know, doing a favor. So everybody paid for their own coffee. I thought, wow, really? You know, I was kind of used to shouting a coffee here or a lunch there, right, and doing all of those sorts of things, because that was, you know, my 90s, 2010s experience. But one of the things with dealing with government, how do you actually work with the government, build relationships without it feeling like you're doing a hard sell or that there's some sort of compliance or governance risk? So one of the things that's actually worked quite well, and I learned this from my time at Telstra, my boss at the time, Christian Turk, and his peers actually conceived of a Telstra productivity indicator. It was a thought leadership program which looked at particular industry verticals, looked at productivity overall for Australia, and it was a fantastic annual piece of research, which was very, very useful. The government picked it up, right? And our companies picked it up, our partners picked it up, the clients picked it up, and they used that information inside their own organisations to help them drive productivity outcomes. I thought that was a great piece of work. So when I became managing director for Google Hong Kong, I wanted a similar piece of work around thought leadership. And that's where we came up with Smarter Digital City. It was conceived in 2016 and we released the first report in 2017. And that looked at smarter retail, smarter travel, smarter finance, and then smarter living as concepts within Hong Kong. We worked really collaboratively with the government. So David Chung, who was from the Information Technology Bureau, was one of the people that we consulted to say, hey, we're thinking about doing this. What do you think? What are the sorts of things that you think the IT Bureau and the government would be interested to know? So they actually helped us to design the questionnaire. Right? We spoke to clients, we spoke to government agencies, we spoke to the Science and Technology Park before we even started the work. Because what I didn't want to assume is that we knew everything. Right? I didn't want to assume that the question set that we would be able to create in isolation as Google was going to be the question set that our government agencies and our client partners and our third-party partners who help us implement, were they the questions that they actually wanted to ask in a very large, very scaled piece of novel research. So that the instrument was shared, right? And then the outcomes and the outputs were shared as well. So as we went through the process of drafting up the final report, we got all of the data back from these interviews, like 1,000 plus interviews across Hong Kong, and we covered, enterprise, small business, consumer. We then went and checked in with our key thought leadership partners, so our key advisors and influencers. So senior officials in government, senior thought leaders in digital technology, and then our senior client partners as well. Got their feedback and just honed that into a really useful report, which we then launched every year with a major event. And it was quite rewarding. As I was leaving Hong Kong, some of the clients actually said that they had all 4 hard copies of the reports that we'd produced and that I'd co-authored, and they kept them on their desk as a resource. And I think that's truly an amazing example of a technology company working really well, not just with government, but also with their clients, to build something that's useful for them. It's not about necessarily selling a product. There'll be a consequence. There'll be a halo effect, obviously, for the organization, but that was not the intent. The intent was to answer a really simple question: how can Hong Kong be a smarter digital city? And if you pose that question to different people, it meant different things. Then you'd have to bring those inputs in and really create something that everybody really felt like they had ownership of. And I think that was fantastic. So, again, as I was leaving Hong Kong in late 2020, I met with a lot of these stakeholders before I left, and we've still got great relationships to this day on the basis of doing that work together.
What were some of your favorite insights, or maybe things that you called out in 2016, 2017 and actually started coming to fruition?
I think what was interesting was probably the demographic, right? So there was always an assumption in Hong Kong, particularly for the elderly, and it's quite funny because in Hong Kong, the elderly is considered over 55, and I'm approaching that age in my 50s. So as a digital native, I don't find 55 particularly old, but there's all these preconceived ideas. So there were 2 ideas or myths that I really wanted to debunk. One was that Hong Kongers don't like to shop online. And 2 was that there was no way that the elderly were really going to embrace digital technologies. And I just fundamentally disagreed with both, because Hong Kong at the time had one of the highest penetrations of mobile technology, right? So for every Hong Konger, there's about 2.5 SIM cards. If you took the taxi drivers that had 5 phones on out, sure, the number comes down a little bit, but basically there is a smartphone in the hands of almost every citizen within Hong Kong. Now, whether they were using them just for checking messages or whether they were actually using them for internet access, right, we didn't know. what ended up coming out of that research over the 4 years that I was working on that program, it started out that, of course, the young were very engaged and had a very high digital engagement score, and that the older were less so. But what was really interesting, the movement, so the young over the 4 years stayed very engaged, as you would expect them to. But one of the biggest changes was in the 40 plus category and the 55 category in terms of their relative digital adoption went up. The ones in the middle, which were pretty much of that generation born after, what am I? I guess am I Gen X? I can't remember which one I'm supposed to be. But the generation who are sort of in their 30s and, probably having kids, etc., that generation didn't change so much, because I think the competing demands of life and family, etc., meant that they sort of just stayed the same. But what was happening for people who were a bit older, their banks were going online, right? All of their services were going online. So they had no choice but to learn how to do these things. And I think that really increased their digital adoption over time. And what it started to do was change the mindsets of marketers and business leaders about how they could build better applications, right? And better ways to serve and better ways to interact. So that was cool. The second point about, Hong Kong is not really loving online shopping, actually was true to a certain extent. I mean, I used to joke in Hong Kong that if shopping was an Olympic sport, Hong Kong would win gold every 4 years, because Hong Kongers just love to shop. They love being out in shopping malls, etc. So I think when we started the research, something like only 4% of Hong Kongers actually shopped regularly online. So of total retail purchases, about 4% were online. What we saw over the 4 years was an increase in online, but I think not just the purchasing of products, but the servicing of those products. That was what was really increasing. So the overall digital score increasing actually meant that people were interacting more with these large organisations through technology, mostly through their mobile phones, but also through, desktops and computers, because what they were finding was that was a faster path to getting them the solution that they wanted. Customers are always going to naturally choose the path that's right for them, right? The one that takes the less time and that gives them the best answer, the best result, the best product, the best service. That's what they're going to do. So I think that was what was really interesting about that research project, was looking at I love a longitudinal study. You can never do a big study like that just once. You've got to keep going.
Right.
So you start in 2017. When I left at the end of 2020, we had 4 years of research at that time. And you could really see how this, just in a very short space of time, this uptake of digital technologies was really quite huge, because it was having a lot of benefit for those individuals, for those individual customers and users. If it doesn't have benefit, right, build it and they will come. Sure, field of dreams, but they won't come and they won't interact and they won't engage unless it genuinely helps them. And that's what we were finding through the research, and it actually played out in all of the statistics as well. Yeah. Pretty cool. Obviously something I was a little passionate about, Dan and Mike.
Yeah. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
And I think maybe kind of one last key question about that is, so now, over recent years, you've gotten involved in board and advisory roles. How do you think about finding and pursuing those kinds of opportunities, and what keeps you motivated to do that stuff outside of the kind of the day job?
Yeah. Again, because I'm naturally curious, and I do get, unfortunately, I do get bored quite quickly. So I like variety in what I'm doing. I also, in terms of the board work, joining my first board, probably, nearly 10 plus years ago, I joined a charity board. The variety of people around the table was really interesting to me. The different backgrounds, the different ways of thinking, their different experiences and what they brought to the table was very different to working in an organization either like Telstra or Google, right? Because I think there's organizations, they do have a certain sameness. They do have values alignment, and they have a particular thing that they do well. So, Telstra is a telco, Google is a technology company. So you do tend to have almost like a vertical way of thinking in those organizations based on the things that they produce, the people that they serve, and what they actually do. When you join a board, if you join the right board, that diversity of people having different experiences is quite amazing, because it ends up having different conversations about how to solve problems. So I might think about solving a problem a particular way, but one of my peers on the board might think completely differently based on their experience. Boards are very safe and respectful places to be able to have those discussions, and then to be able to try and, ask very good questions of the executive team of why does something work that way, how are we actually going to increase either fundraising, or the revenues, depending on whether it's not for profit or profit. And I really love that kind of, I think, not just an intellectual challenge, but also being able to collaborate with really smart people. And you find that, I think, on boards or as advisors to startups and other companies. So that's, I think it keeps me really interested, and it keeps both my mind and my skills sharp, right? Because as you know, I got a lot of energy. I like to feel like I'm really contributing. And so again, your earlier question about which ones do you actually choose and how do you actually choose board or advisory roles? Well, right. First and foremost, you need to be aligned to the mission, vision and values of that organisation. It needs to be somewhere where you think that your skills, experience and capabilities can actually add some value. But I think also what's really important is that chemistry between yourself, the chair, and the other board members and executives. You really want a lot of those things to work, because again, a lot of this stuff, it really does boil down to trust, right? If you have those relationships and you can build trust, you can then bring your best self to the table in terms of actually wanting to make a positive difference to that organisation. That's how I kind of think about it all. It's like a reverse interview process in some respects. I just want to make sure that I'm the right fit, because right. The way that I am, I'm pretty happy with where I've ended up and how I show up these days. But my particular skill set, my approach may not be for everybody. So you actually have to have those conversations to make sure that you'll be the right fit, and that you can also, I think, be able to speak your mind quite freely, and then have those ideas with your collaborators come to life, because then that becomes quite rewarding. Again, back to that point of you don't want to be set in stone and standing still. You want to be thinking about how do you constructively challenge to bring benefit and make things better.
Yeah, and I can see, from your description how it kind of adds this whole new dimension to working life, and it makes me wonder, coming full circle. The first question, you mentioned your mom, and she wasn't, when she wasn't doing kind of full-time work anymore, she found kind of avenues for learning and growth and contribution through board work and charity work. And so I guess that having that role model, maybe, does that play a part into kind of how you think about these things?
I think it probably does. Yeah, it really does. I mean, one of the things I've always tried to instill in my own children is to say to them, what are you going to do to make a difference to the world, right? I don't really mind what it is that you do with your career. And I joke, life is long and mostly boring, so you really need to do it with love. When you're little kids, you haven't got kids yet, Dan, have you?
No, not yet. No.
When you have them, Michael, have you got children?
No, not yet.
When you have kids, whatever language is your language that you speak at home, the number one thing you're going to hear is, I'm bored. So what I used to always say to my kids is, yep, life is long and mostly boring, which is an important lesson in why you need to do things and spend time with people that you love. That's super important. So, I look at that in all aspects of my work and my life and my friendships. I choose to spend time where I value and I am valued. And it's a really lovely way to live. And I think, there's plenty of organizations out there and plenty of companies and plenty of groups that you could join. But being, I think, very sure of yourself and actually knowing where you'll be able to show up and be your best is really important. And that's one of the things I think that, I spend a bit of time working on, and just making sure that I'm within those groups where it will bring out the best in me. Yeah, that's cool. I have that here back in Melbourne with a lot of friendships.
That's wonderful.
And my golf game's getting much better here as well, by the way.
Oh, great. Well, is there any kind of last things that you want to bring up or share with our listeners? We're wrapping up.
Well, thanks very much to you and Michael for the opportunity. I think the only thing I'd say is my favorite quote of all time is Oscar Wilde: "Be yourself. Everyone else is already taken." Right? And I think that's what I've always endeavored to do. As I said before, I'm a poor impersonation of somebody else. So I basically spent my life and career just trying to be and bring my best self. And most of the time that works out, some days not so good. But the fortunate thing for me, I think, is that I'm surrounded by family and friends who care deeply. And when I trip and fall, they pick me up and help me keep going. And I think that's the most amazing thing. That for me is the mark of a life well lived. So, that's what I'd leave your audience with. Be yourself. Everyone else is already taken.
Beautiful. And Leonie, what's the best way for folks to follow you, hear what you're up to, keep in touch?
LinkedIn. So you can follow me on LinkedIn. That's LinkedIn is my favorite social media. That's where I tend to post most of my thoughts and what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, etc. Yeah. So follow me on LinkedIn. That'd be great.
All right. Yeah. Plus one. I think LinkedIn is underrated sometimes as a social media.
Yeah.
There's a lot of good stuff on there.
Yeah, there is. I spend a lot of my time reading on LinkedIn these days.
Yeah, there is. I mean, there is a lot of unnecessary self-promotion that you see a lot. But you can mute things.
Right.
Yeah, you can always find the mute button. I should have worn my "You're on mute" T-shirt today, Dan. Maybe next time we catch up.
Maybe next time. Great. Well, our guest today has been Leonie Valentine. Leonie, thanks so much for being part of the craft.
Thank you. Thanks again.
And thank you all for listening to the Craft Podcast. For more links and information about this episode, you can look below if you're watching on YouTube, or you can search for the Craft Podcast on YouTube or anywhere you get your podcasts. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you've enjoyed this video and want to see more. Like I said before, you could win $1 billion. I mean, you never know. Just click the subscribe button. It could happen. All right. See you next. And until then, keep crafting.
Bye.